Well, I'll try to be very brief in order not to put yeah, okay, I'll try to be brief. Tertiary retention and necessary default could also have been entitled tertiary retention and privation. I want to start this homage by introducing the following very shocking paradox. If we would have to think of the death of Bernard using his concept of tertiary retention, we would be obliged to say that his passing makes no difference. And by God, that means something. The differential logic he has tried to put in place is really hovering there. Tertiary retentions remain, but Bernard is dead, and we know this makes an immense difference. We feel the passing of our friend as a privation that no trace can heal. We can mourn, we can commemorate, but his persona, shall we say his psyche, his soul, is not there anymore for us to attend to. To approach this grief, we have to sort out a number of things. First, we have to understand that what he did was more than expropriating the old concept of technics in a differential logic. Second, we have to ask ourselves what tertiary retentions are and what they are unable to keep for us. And since tertiary retention is the very concept of something that is kept, the experience of our mourning can probably help us in understanding what it leaves out. Thirdly, we have to ask ourselves how the experience of this death may point beyond the legacy of his concept of tertiary retention to another contribution of his thought, that is his interpretation of mortality as a mode of being that can be historial because it's historical. And we can refer to what Georgios remarked about the images of twitching. The expression that famously indicates this twist in his thinking, is the understanding of our being in the world as necessary default, the défaut qu'il faut. Bernard proposed the concept of tertiary retention in an analysis of Husserl's phenomenology of time consciousness. He basically took back Husserl's position on the technical support of scientific knowledge into his earlier analysis of time consciousness and combined this with the analysis of tool being in Heidegger's being in time. It permitted Bernard to renew Derrida's insight into the necessity of a trace for recovering experience. Perception occurs in time, and as such, it's always already lost as time goes by. Only a trace, as Derrida would have it, or a technical support, as Bernard would say, can allow us to fixate an experience, that is, to render it accessible in another moment. But the technical trace of an experience is not this experience. It's only a material support that allows us to perform an identical experience, but not the same one. And although a trace or a technical support may allow us to recover an experience, it will never be able to restitute the experience of which it is a trace or an image. For instance, the photograph of Bernard on the poster. Although Bernard didn't publish, I proceed to go a bit faster. We proceed to the défaut qu'il faut. Although Bernard didn't publish as yet the text where he wrote about the necessary default thematically, nevertheless, its idea is introduced from the very beginning of Bernard's work. The text was called Idiocy, Jean-Luc Nancy referred to it, and it would become the 7th volume of Technics in Time. There are two features in the history of this text that might throw light on its subject. First, it would be the seminal text of Technics in Time. And second, the reason why the thematic development of the notion of the necessary default time and again has been purported by Bernard, up to putting it at the 7th book of Technics in Time. The reason was a lack of evidence. This throws a different light on the whole project of Technics in Time. And sorry. Since it implies that it would not be tertiary tension that would be the central notion of Technics in Time, but necessary default. And I want to add the reason why the evidence for this default is missing lies in the very form of this idiocy. That is, it's lacking, it's a privation, and there is a necessity to that. I come back to tertiary tension now. The concept of tertiary tension does not only concern languages, it includes all traces. And although it's conceived of the experience of deconstruction, this extension implies a major change in respect to Derrida's grammatology. Tertiary tensions are not only arbitrary signs, but more generally traces of sensitiveness. Sensitiveness of tools as much as sensitiveness of humans. The inscription of the forms of reality by any tool may be very different according to the power of the sensitiveness of that tool, and they can differ greatly in comparison to our own perceptive sensitiveness, and especially from our perceptions. For most of the tools we are using, this means an empowerment of our capacities. But as Bernard abundantly illustrated, each empowerment also produces the possibility of its own backfire. What tertiary tensions leave out is living presence, perception, says Bernard. But if we think of tertiary tensions as a loss, we have to say that all perceptions are the place of such a loss. That is what is contained in Derrida's deconstruction in Voice and Phenomenon. In fact, the very notion of impression, as explained in Aristotle's De Anima, is already the figure of such a loss. The imprint of the bronze seal in wax, retaining the form of it, but leaving out the matter, is already that figure of the loss. However materialistic Bernard's thoughts about tertiary tensions may be, it seems that they cannot keep reality for us. And precisely this is the sense of the necessity of their default. Remembering Bernard's death is thinking about living with such a loss. However, the image of the imprint may not lead us astray and make us think that what is lost is only matter. Here we have to come back to the strength of phenomenological approach that points to the irreducibility of sensitivity and of that of perception in particular. What we miss in tertiary tensions, in Husserl's language, image awareness, is that of which it is supposed to be an image. in this case Bernard as a living person, meaning Bernard being present to us in this very moment. And since this is not the case, we have to ask more precisely, what are we missing? We could invoke Aristotle, saying that, for instance, Bernard is this person whose primary essence is what it was, thereby leaving the problem entire on how to remember the past that is referred to in this formula, a past that of necessity is what it has been. Aristotle's solution to determine Bernard as having such and such a form doesn't alter his position as to the reality of primary essences. Secondary essences, as Aristotle says, respond to the requirements of primary essence, but there remains a difference. Heidegger would put it, they respond to the requirements of being. But there's a history to this solution. Modern science and modern technology doesn't respond to the requirements of being. Modern thought proposes concepts that require being to respond to them. Today, we know that these modern essences are as much an arbitrary social construction than a natural form. Bernard would say it's an epiphylogenetic technical product of thought. Essence in its modern, that is, in its scientific form, takes hold of reality in the fixed form of a mathesis universalis. But so do tertiary tensions. The big divide between the product of modernity and its falling apart in deconstruction or in self-destruction is the very inside of phenomenology that modernity fell short in its self-understanding. The need of stressing loss in every articulation of its conceptuality is motivated by this finding. It was the motto of Husserl's crisis essay. It motivated Heidegger's inquiry into being, and it was the very motive of Derrida's deconstruction. Pursuing these inquiries, Bernard proposed a new attention to techniques and to history. In a sense, one could read techniques in time in two ways. One that would stress the role of techniques, and another that would stress the role of time. Because it's so pervasive, having read the book, one remains mostly with the story of the maddening evolution of modern technology and its consequences. But just as pervasive in this book is the story of time, which is the story of the idios that doesn't succeed to live up to his text, to his idiotext. And it's not surprising then that it is precisely this part that we are missing with Bernard's passing. It's not surprising, since the idios is that what is missing evidence again and again. But what is more, it even applies to ourselves and to our thoughts or our knowledge about ourselves. If there's a lesson of what Bernard taught, it's surely that we didn't experience most of what we think. That even applies to what we think about ourselves. Bernard showed that time consciousness only perceives in a dynamic of loss that has to admit the necessity of a technical support. The task of knowledge thereby transformed itself into a problem of access. Eventually, this ended in an important critique of the industrial production of temporal objects, which tend to reduce experience to immediacy. Real-time products tend to eliminate the difficulty of access obliterating the problem of loss completely. Now, although it's true that it's essential to techniques that they can be taught or shared, the realm of techniques is traditionally understood in contradistinction with nature. Nature has its principle in itself. Techniques, however, can do what is impossible for nature to do. Aristotle defines techne as a contingent production that has its principle in something else, in the technician. In Bernard's formulation, on the contrary, life is produced in a technical way. It has become a technical life. The principle of this technical life is not to be found in the soul, as in Aristotle, but in an exosomatic support. Strangely enough, this somehow means a reorientation of Aristotle's definition of techniques in the direction of living nature. The work of the exosomatic support, which is the principle of this technical life, is indeed not characterized as a production, that is what is the case in Aristotle, but as a continuation of life. So there's a real, it's a turnaround. The techniques produces life, natural, living nature, but as technical life, of course. And this makes sense since this reorientation makes sense since the rise of modern technology has become a threat to the biosphere. This might be the historical significance of his philosophical project. It's an answer to Heidegger's analysis of modernity as enframing, but with an access to a historical task. That was the main critique of Technics and Time, that the history was totally put out of place and was totally replaced by an existential analysis that headed only for the historical dimension. But Bernard has returned this, has reintroduced this problem of access to the historical. So this reorientation is his answer to the analysis of modernity as enframing, with an access to a historical task, the task of reorienting technology in view of the continuation of life. Paradoxically, this access is not characterized as a protension, but as a retention. When Bernard designates techniques as tertiary retentions, we end up with a picture of techniques as a concept of memory, a sedimented memory. This is paradoxical. If you know Bernard, you know he was full of projects, and nevertheless, and every technician who wants to produce something is always projecting something. Bernard preferred to call techniques a retention, and precisely this move is very, very important. It is really the reorientation of the definition of techniques in Aristotle because of the enframing, which is typical for the modern technology. It would not perhaps apply to the technology in ancient sense, but it's certainly to the point for the technology that has become a threat to the biosphere. So to conceive the techniques as a retention of life, a continuation of life, of living nature, instead of the production of anything that you can conceive of, is a very, very strong gesture. So I will leave it by this in order not to take too much time. Thank you.